Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this presentation is on the High Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are generally broken into three different parts. The Early Middle Ages, which is most characterized by the time of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and the Carolingian Empire. The High Middle Ages, which generally is dated from around about 1000 to 1300 CE. And the Late Middle Ages, which is of course usually associated with the Black Death. This presentation is particularly concerned with aspects of the High Middle Ages, the period that we see most associated with the highest level of intellectual development during the Middle Ages, of architectural advancement during the Middle Ages, and of the development of towns and cities during the High Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are, I want to go ahead and put this stuff up here for you. The Middle Ages is associated with feudalism. Now, I have the feudal system in quotation marks because in reality, when we refer to feudal Europe or the feudal system, in reality, it is not a system. Historians in the past at times referred to feudalism or the feudal system as though it were a consistent form of organization across Europe. In reality, it really differs and varies tremendously depending on the place and time. And so calling it a system, which implies that it is sort of a coherent and organized method of organizing labor and political power and so forth in Europe, is really inaccurate. It's really not a system, but rather it is a practice that varies significantly and is particularly an organizational principle, a political organizational principle that is centered around the usage of land and of obligations and of loyalty of a vassal to a lord. So in this depiction here, we have a king effectively knighting a vassal. In feudal Europe, the basic organizational structure of political power and of land use in the area was driven by what's called the lord-vassal relationship. So every lord had a vassal, and vassals oftentimes had vassals as well. In this relationship, the lord would provide to the vassal a fief. Generally, the fief took the form of land, and the fief was not actually, the land was not actually given to the vassal, but rather was effectively loaned to the vassal. And in exchange for the loan of the fief, if you will, the vassal was obligated to be loyal to the king, to the lord, and to provide military service. Most commonly. Though there are, as you see at the list below, there are other obligations of the vassal to the lord beyond military service. The vassal would be responsible for responding to calls of the lord to his court, for providing hospitality to the lord, providing ransom payment if the lord were taken prisoner. It might also involve marriage of the eldest daughter. And likewise, the obligations of the lord were to provide protection, to provide the land, and provide a basic system of maintenance for the kingdom. So the land is provided by the lord, and it's in the form of a fief, and in exchange for this, the vassal provides generally military service. Knights, heavily armored cavalry officers, made up really the backbone of military service during the Middle Ages. And the knights, of course, the vassals were all generally of well-off families, and they had to be able to fund and arm themselves. They had to be able to acquire swords and build armor and so forth. And so it was a relationship between the lord and the lord's vassals, and it involved military service, political affiliations, and the operation and maintenance and productivity of the land. And sometimes it's referred to as the feudal system, but to call it a system implies that it is the same in every area of the realm, and that is actually of Europe, and that's actually not the case, but it varies tremendously, and in no way, shape, or form was it a formally adopted system, but rather a rather loose structure of power relationships in Europe between lords and vassals. The agricultural production in Europe during the High Middle Ages occurred on agricultural estates or manors, and this could be referred to as the manorial system. On the manorial system, every manor, and churches had manors as well as did lords and vassals, they owned land, and the land is worked by a population known as serfs. Serfs are effectively the peasant population. In some respects, if anybody knows about American history post-Civil War, a serf is sort of like a sharecropper. The serf works the land, doesn't own the land, but is allowed to live on the land, is allowed to work the land for basic sustenance of themselves, but in the process they provide a rent to the lord, which usually was about a third of the manor's produce. They provided a tithe to the church, so they basically were paying a rent to the land that allowed them to subsist on the land. The land was not theirs. They could not hunt the animals on the land or the fish in the streams. These were all deemed the rights of the lord. And so the serfs were basically a group of individuals that were bound to the land but did not own the land and could not advance personally. They couldn't, earn enough to become in a higher status in society. They had no access to education. They had really no access to acquiring land or any kind of personal wealth. And so they're bound to the land as effectively a servant agricultural labor population that was locked in a system in which they had to provide a certain amount of work and a certain amount of rent to the lord at such a level that it effectively locked them into their particular station in society. It made it impossible for them to ever have any kind of upward mobility. As I mentioned, the serfs made up about 60% of Europe's population during the High Middle Ages. They had to provide about a third of their produce to the lord. They had to work for 3 days a week on the lands, on the lord's lands, which was separate from the lands that they used to subsist. They provided a tenth, which was a tithe, to the local church, and these manorial agricultural estates were appointed and run by a bailiff. And here you see the peasants or the serfs being kind of directed and organized by a bailiff who ran the lord's manors. And as I said, churches and monasteries had their own manorial estates as well, and had a similar process of agricultural production. Society in the Middle Ages. In the High Middle Ages, you see the advent of university educations. The University of Paris was formed in 1200. The University of Oxford was formed in 1208. University education centered largely around Latin, around theology, around ancient ideas pertaining to medicine, anatomy, and these types of things. Really ideas that came from antiquity, and in many cases, of course, were significantly in error, but primarily the education of the Middle Ages centered around the so-called liberal arts, and this would have been learning with respect to the works of philosophy of religion, learning Latin, and these types of things. During the University of the High Middle Ages, you don't have disciplines like history, for example, that are studied. These are not the focus. Rather, the focus are the traditional sort of liberal arts of antiquity. Oftentimes in the High Middle Ages, you see towns as well as university students form guilds. And a guild is similar to unionization. Towns would form guilds around certain types of production. So certain towns that produce certain types of textiles might form a certain textile guild in which they set rules and prices and so forth to the manufacture of textiles. And this was designed to protect their wages and protect their their well-being, as you see the development of towns and cities in Europe. Similarly, students formed their own student guilds, which were designed to create sort of unionization of students, where students would band together and create a Greek guild that would be designed to assure that the communities that they lived in, as when they went to college, did not price gouge the rent prices. Oftentimes the communities, the sort of college towns, if you will, that people would go to, you would travel great distances to come to these areas, and you had to pay for room and board. And so in order to prevent local communities charging excessive rents, the students formed guilds that were designed to lobby local authorities to maintain that rents were reasonably priced. Student guilds also placed demands on expectations of their professors. If a professor was seen to be underperforming and students didn't feel like they were getting their fair due when it came to education, they could use the guild to lobby the school to ensure that the teacher provided them with the best education for their money. The High Middle Ages, of course, also is the height of sort of the medieval knight. And medieval knights received their training in tournaments. Most people associate the tournament, which is of course depicted here, the tournament as a sort of public contest that centered around things like the joust. Interestingly, the joust, in which individuals would ride on horseback and seek to knock the opponent off of horseback. The joust was in a lot of ways a more humane variation of the tournament that was a response to demands by the church, for example, to end the practice of the melee. And what you see depicted here in this artwork is an example of a medieval melee. The melees were sort of like war games in which knights from various principalities would engage in sort of mock battles in which they used blunted weapons, not designed to kill, but effectively engaged in a rather rough and brutal form of engagement with neighboring kingdoms. Oftentimes the goal of these melees, of these tournaments, were to take individuals captive. It was known that if a lord was taken captive, it was one of the obligations of a vassal to pay a ransom for their lord. And so many of these melees centered around the goal of taking significant individuals captive and then demanding ransom for their release. And some individuals who were quite effective in the tournaments during the Middle Ages made significant personal wealth on their ability to take prisoners and obtain ransom. So these were oftentimes public events. They were oftentimes they were ways of practicing military affairs, but they were also sources of personal accolade and also potentially personal wealth. And here you see an artistic depiction of a joust. Now, thought in the Middle Ages was, oftentimes when individuals from the Renaissance looked back in the Middle Ages, they thought of the Middle Ages as though it was like a dark age, an age in which nothing of great significance happened. Oftentimes, Renaissance thinkers believed that they were jumping over the Middle Ages and going back to the time of antiquity, the rebirth of sort of the Hellenistic age and the works of the great philosophers. In some respects, that might be true. However, in many respects, the Renaissance was carrying through a continuity with respects to intellectual revival of Greek thought that occurred during the High Middle Ages. And of course, one of the reasons why individuals in the Renaissance looked at the Middle Ages as a dark age is because if you were born in 1400, the way that you would remember the Middle Ages would probably be by the memory of the Black Death, the Great Plague, which occurred during the late Middle Ages. But in the High Middle Ages, in fact, there was a significant intellectual revival. And there were great thinkers like Abelard of Bath, for example, who was one of the greatest thinkers of the High Middle Ages, who translated from Arabic, Euclid's Elements, and works of algebra. And of course, these were very significant because it demonstrates again the fact that Euclid's Elements were translated from Arabic was very significant because again it demonstrates the importance of the Islamic world to allowing for the intellectual revivals in Europe to occur. In the modern age, we often think that that the Islamic world was somehow backwards and somehow gave no great contributions to the intellectual revivals that occurred in the High Middle Ages or in the Renaissance. But in reality, as we've studied in our class, the Islamic world was fundamental to the development of intellectual revival in Europe during the High Middle Ages and beyond. In Europe, intellectual thought often took the form of what we call scholasticism. And scholasticism was generally the idea taken by religious individuals that reason could be used to justify and legitimize faith, that you could use reason to effectively prove aspects of one's religious belief. There were different schools who argued about ideas of antiquity. There was a group known as the Realists, and the Realists very much were influenced by the works of Plato when it came to knowledge. There was other groups like the Nominalists who agreed with the thoughts of Aristotle when it came to issues of knowledge and truth. They engaged in and argued and debated about issues pertaining to knowledge and the old Greek concept, Plato and Aristotle's concepts of the forms. Plato believed that effectively nobody could gain knowledge from the observations of finite images of forms, that you could only gain knowledge by contemplating the universal forms that existed beyond humanity in the metaphysical realm. So if you wanted to gain knowledge of, for example, a table, what a table is, tableness, if you will, the only way you could gain this for Plato was by contemplating the universal form, tableness. By contrast, of course, we mentioned earlier in this class that Aristotle asserted that while he did believe in these universal forms, he believed that people could gain knowledge of these forms by contemplating their finite image in the everyday world. So Aristotle believed that you could examine, for example, one specific or particular table or chair and learn about the universal form. So Europeans during the Middle Ages began to debate these topics again. These are the arguments of antiquity and of ancient Greece, and scholars are again engaging the philosophical ideas of Plato and of Aristotle when it comes to knowledge and the forms. One of the greatest thinkers of the High Middle Ages was St. Thomas Aquinas, who was very much a scholastic and very much believed that he could use reason to legitimize or to prove effectively his faith. St. Thomas Aquinas argued using what was called the dialectic. And this is something that really, anytime you write a paper, you really use this basic process of the dialectic. And this is the basic process of posing a question, a hypothesis, then appealing to evidence and sources to answer that question, and then to draw a conclusion that is a rational or logical, I should say, logically consistent in leading from that evidence. So you provide a hypothesis, you ask a question, you use evidence and sources to argue for it, and then you draw from that evidence and those sources a conclusion. So it's kind of a rather fundamental process in terms of logic and reasoning. St. Thomas Aquinas actually used this method to attempt to prove the existence of God. And his argument for the existence of God is sometimes called the argument from design. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that he could examine, the question, if you will, is there a God? And St. Thomas Aquinas uses the evidence of what he sees in the cosmos and in the earth as the evidence of intelligence design. So his evidence, his source, was the material world. And according to him, he concluded that the material world provided evidence of intelligent design. And so he concluded from the empirical evidence of the world that that the structure of nature, that the seeming organization of the cosmos and of the earth meant that there must be an intelligent designer. Now, from an argumentative standpoint, philosophers would generally say over time that his argument's not valid. Now, just because an argument's not valid doesn't necessarily mean it's false. It just means that the conclusion does not logically derive or necessarily derive from the premises. So, St. Thomas Aquinas said, "Is there a God?" And then he looks around him and he sees nature and the wonder of nature, and he says, well, this is clearly evidence of intelligent design. Therefore, because he sees intelligent design in nature, therefore the intelligent designer is God. Basically, that's the gist of this argument. But it's not necessarily the case, of course, just because nature appears from one perspective to be the result of an intelligent designer does not necessarily mean that it is. And so philosophers would generally regard this particular argument, the argument from design, as an invalid argument. But St. Thomas Aquinas provided this argument as his way, as a scholastic, of using reason to justify or to justify his faith through logic and argument. And so here you really see the fusion of not only religion and faith, but the fusion of the sort of philosophical traditions of thought and argument and reasoning from the ancient world. And scholastics like St. Thomas Aquinas believed that man had, through this, an ability to obtain metaphysical truth. And you still hear individuals making these types of arguments, the arguments of design, for example, to this day. The last bit that I want to show you real quick, and there's not a whole lot of notes for this slide, but I want to introduce you a little bit to architecture during the Middle Ages. There's two predominant forms of architecture found during the High Middle Ages. One is the Romanesque architecture, and the other is Gothic architecture. So the first sort of pan-European architecture, if you will, is Romanesque architecture. Romanesque architecture, which you see here an example of this abbey from Normandy, France. Romanesque architecture is generally believed to have begun roughly around 6th to 10th century Common Era. But it's very, very common throughout the Middle-Aged period. Romanesque architecture is generally associated with symmetrical building plans, thick walls, and the usage of archways, of pillars, and so forth. The usage of, for example, vaulted archways like you see here on the inside of the abbey, and you can see in this picture also the columns. So Romanesque architecture was really the first pan-European architectural form. And you see examples of this all across Western Europe during the Middle Ages. And it was many of the technological architectural advances of the Middle Age, of the Romanesque architecture, that makes Gothic architecture really possible. And here we see a Gothic cathedral from northern France. This is the facade of the cathedral. Gothic cathedrals were really a building, an architectural building style that is uniquely linked to the High Middle Ages. Is a great example, too, of why the Middle Ages was not a dark period or a dark ages, as this was a tremendous advancement in engineering and architecture that took a tremendous amount of mobilization on the societal level, and also they speak to the tremendous amount of power held by the church at this time as well, as these types of building projects could take decades to complete. The Gothic style cathedral generally would be associated with thinner walls, but much higher ceilings. The Gothic cathedrals are associated with these large stained glass windows. They're associated with what are called flying buttresses and vaulted ceilings. And so if you see how the ceiling has these kind of archways that rise up into these sort of pointed archways at the top, these would be referred to as flying buttresses, and together they create vaulted ceilings. And these structures are massively impressive, and they're huge building projects. You see, the Gothic church here in northern France, took basically half a century to complete, which is a huge testament to the advancements architecturally of the society. It's also a testament to the relative health of the society at the time, and also the power of the Catholic Church at the time. These types of churches very much made a person entering these churches feel the sort of overwhelming, sublime reality of human existence met against the sort of vast and superior metaphysical reality of God. As you get that feeling from these high, tremendously sweeping vaulted ceilings that embody the cathedral. The Gothic architecture is built to a large degree on Romanesque architecture, and Gothic architecture is really more splendid, more fantastic in terms of experience, and very much a demonstration of the advancement of middle-aged Europe.